June 4, 1942. The Central Pacific Ocean. The sky above Midway Atoll was pale and empty. The kind of empty that lies before catastrophe. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey squinted through his cockpit glass. Below him, nothing but ocean. His fuel gauge crept toward danger. His squadron had been flying blind for nearly an hour, searching for a fleet that should have been right beneath them. 33 American dive bombers, loaded with 1,000-pound bombs circling over open water. And then, a white line. A single Japanese destroyer, cutting through the blue like a scar. McCluskey made a decision. He followed it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where history stops being a textbook and starts being something you feel. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We have viewers on every continent who refuse to let these stories disappear. What happened next would not be decided by generals in gilded command rooms. It would be decided by exhausted pilots, burning fuel, and one desperate gamble above an empty sea. And in 6 minutes, the entire course of World War II turned on its axis. To understand why Midway mattered, you first have to understand what Japan had already done. In the 6 months before June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy carved a path of destruction across the Pacific that stunned the world. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Japan moved like a force of nature, rapid, relentless, and seemingly unstoppable. By spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched across nearly 2 million square miles of ocean and land. No empire in modern history had expanded so far, so fast. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the architect of this expansion. He was not a man given to celebration. Even after Pearl Harbor, he wrote in his diary that he feared Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. He was right. But he also believed that one final decisive blow, one battle that shattered American naval power, could force the United States to negotiate rather than fight. That blow was supposed to land at Midway Atoll. Midway was a tiny pair of islands near the center of the Pacific, strategically modest on its own, but close enough to Hawaii that the Americans would have to defend it. When they did, Yamamoto planned to annihilate whatever remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, specifically its aircraft carriers, which had escaped Pearl Harbor. He committed 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, dozens of cruisers, and over 150,000 tons of warships. It was the most powerful naval strike force the Pacific had ever seen. What Yamamoto did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that the Americans were reading his mail. Deep below street level in Pearl Harbor, inside a basement known as Station HYPO, Navy codebreakers were quietly dismantling Japan's most closely guarded secret. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the team. He was brilliant and relentless, a man who wore a smoking jacket to work and hadn't left the building in weeks. His team had partially cracked JN-25, Japan's naval cipher. Through fragments of intercepted messages, they identified a massive Japanese operation targeting a location coded only as AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Washington was not convinced, so he arranged a trap. Midway broadcast a false radio message, in the clear, about a water distillation problem on the atoll. Within days, Japanese intelligence reported to Tokyo that AF was short on fresh water. Confirmation secured. AF was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew what was coming, when it was coming, and roughly how. He had 3 carriers, the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown, which had been so badly damaged at Coral Sea that Japanese intelligence estimated 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave his shipyard crews 72 hours. They welded, patched, and reinforced in round-the-clock shifts. In 2 days, the Yorktown was battle-ready, not perfect, but present. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese. The odds weren't comfortable, but surprise and that invisible weapon had changed sides. Wade McCluskey was 38 years old. He had spent his career in naval aviation and only recently transitioned to dive bombers. He was not famous. He had not been pre-selected by history for greatness. On the morning of June 4th, he was simply a pilot doing his job and running out of time. The American carriers launched before dawn. The plan called for coordinated strikes, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters arriving together. But coordination in combat is a polite ambition. The torpedo squadrons arrived first and flew straight into a massacre. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese fleet and went in low and slow, the only approach their obsolete Devastator aircraft allowed. The Japanese Zeros were waiting. 15 planes from the Hornet went in. 15 were shot down. Not one torpedo found its mark. Every man in Waldron's squadron was killed except Ensign George Gay, who floated beneath a seat cushion and watched the rest of the battle from the sea. 2 more torpedo squadrons followed. Same result. 41 torpedo bombers attacked. 35 were destroyed. 0 hits. The Japanese fleet emerged without a scratch. Their fighter screen, now circling low and fast after chasing down the Devastators, was perfectly positioned to annihilate the next wave. Nobody told Wade McCluskey the torpedo bombers had been slaughtered. He was still searching. The sea below him was blue and unbroken. His fuel gauge offered no comfort. He had minutes left to find the fleet or turn back. Turning back meant failure. Turning back meant the Japanese carriers survived to strike again. McCluskey turned his formation southeast, following the lone destroyer, and flew on borrowed fuel into the unknown. At 10:20 in the morning, he found them. 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed in formation below him, their decks crowded with armed aircraft. The torpedo attacks had kept the Zeros pinned low. The sky above the carriers was nearly undefended. McCluskey saw it instantly. He gave the order. At that same moment, almost to the second, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived over the Soryu with his squadron from the Yorktown. 2 American groups, from 2 different carriers, arrived above the Japanese fleet within 90 seconds of each other. Not by plan, not by design, by the chaotic mercy of war. The Zeros, still at wave-top height, never had time to climb. What happened in the next 6 minutes has been analyzed for over 80 years. McCluskey's dive bombers began their attack runs at 10:22. By 10:28, 3 Japanese carriers were engulfed in fires that no human hand could stop. The Kaga took 4 direct hits. Fuel lines ruptured. Armed bombs stacked on the flight deck detonated in sequence. The ship became a furnace. The Akagi took just 2 hits, but one struck amid the armed aircraft in the hangar, and the explosions tore the ship apart from the inside. The Soryu burned so fast and so completely that her captain, Ryusaku Yamamoto, refused to leave the bridge. He stood at the rail and sang the national anthem as the ship went under. All 3 carriers sank before nightfall. 900 Japanese sailors and airmen died in those 6 minutes. Hundreds of the most experienced naval aviators in the world, men who had flown at Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, and Ceylon, were dead or burning. The aircraft, the fuel, the irreplaceable combat experience, and all of it went into the sea. Below, Ensign George Gay floated alone in the wreckage of his squadron. He watched smoke rise from 3 dying carriers and understood through exhaustion and grief that something enormous had shifted. He could not have known how much. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, escaped the first wave. She launched counterstrikes that found the Yorktown and crippled her. 3 bombs, then 2 torpedoes. American crew fought desperately to save her. The Yorktown was eventually abandoned and later sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow. But the Hiryu's revenge lasted hours. American dive bombers from the Enterprise found her late that same afternoon. 4 bombs, 4 hits. The Hiryu was gone by morning. All 4 Japanese carriers, the same 4 that struck Pearl Harbor, were destroyed within 24 hours. Japan lost 4 carriers, 322 aircraft, and over 3,000 men. America lost the Yorktown, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The mathematics of catastrophe were entirely Japanese. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles to the northwest, received the reports in silence. He had staked the Empire's greatest instrument of war on a single engagement, and lost it. He canceled the operation. He turned the fleet toward home, He never spoke of Midway again. The rain came that night. It fell across burning oil slicks and empty flight decks. It fell on lifeboats where Japanese sailors drifted for days without rescue. It fell on the Yorktown as she settled beneath the surface. It fell on Midway's flight line, where mechanics worked through the dark, patching whatever had come back. McCluskey had been hit during the attack. Shrapnel from a Zero's guns had torn into his arm and shoulder. He flew his damaged aircraft back to the Enterprise on fumes and willpower. When the ship's doctor examined him, he counted 7 shrapnel wounds. McCluskey asked only how many bombs had found their targets. When they told him, he closed his eyes. He had nothing left to say. The men who came home quietly. No parades. The battle was classified for years. Revealing the victory would have exposed the code-breaking operation. Rochefort, whose brilliance made everything possible, was denied the Distinguished Service Medal by Washington bureaucrats who resented his methods. He received it 33 years later, 6 years after his death. History does not always honor its architects on time. In Tokyo, the defeat was buried. Wounded sailors were brought ashore at night. Families received vague notifications weeks later. The official reports announced victory. Japan would not acknowledge the loss publicly until the war was over. But inside the Imperial Navy, the truth was impossible to contain. Before Midway, Japan had 6 fleet carriers. After Midway, 2. Before Midway, Japan had hundreds of elite aviators with years of combat experience. After Midway, most of them were gone. New ships could be built. New pilots could not be trained fast enough. By the end of 1942, American shipyards were launching a carrier roughly every 3 months. In the entire war, Japan commissioned 17 carriers. The United States commissioned over 150. Midway didn't create that imbalance, but it forced Japan to fight from inside it immediately with nothing left in reserve. Guadalcanal followed in August 1942. Then the Solomon Islands. Then the grinding island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American pilots destroyed so many Japanese aircraft in a single day that they called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By then, the outcome of the war had been sealed for 2 full years. Midway had written the verdict. Waldron's torpedo squadron was wiped to the last man. Their sacrifice, 30 men, 15 planes, 0 hits, had held the Japanese Zeros at wave-top height long enough for the dive bombers to arrive. They died without knowing what they had made possible. Their contribution was invisible in the moment and decisive in retrospect. History is full of men like this. Men whose deaths only make sense from 30,000 feet and 80 years away. George Gay was rescued the morning after the battle. He had spent the night floating in the debris field of his squadron, watching 3 carriers burn. He said later he had the best seat in the house for the most important show of the war. He lived until 1994. He never forgot a single hour of it. Yamamoto continued to command after Midway. A rational man trapped inside an irrational momentum. He knew the war's outcome was now a matter of time. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters, guided by the same intercepted intelligence that had made Midway possible, shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. He died in the jungle, 60 miles from the sea he had commanded. The sleeping giant had found him at last. 6 minutes. That is all it took. 6 minutes of screaming dive bombers and desperate maneuvers and bombs falling through morning air. 6 minutes to break the most powerful carrier fleet in the Pacific. 6 minutes that cracked the foundation of an empire that had seemed immovable. The battle was won by codebreakers in a basement, by torpedo crews who flew into certain death, by a pilot who followed a lone destroyer on the last of his fuel and refused to turn back. It was won by the accumulated weight of small, desperate decisions made by men who had no time to think about history. They were not fighting for monuments or recognition. Most were too exhausted to think past the next instrument reading, the next horizon. They fought because there was nothing else to do. And in doing that, in simply refusing to stop, they gave the world 6 minutes that changed everything. The sound of dive bombers falling toward the sea, once the anthem of Japanese invincibility, became the sound of an empire beginning its long descent. the Pacific would burn for 3 more years. But after June 4, 1942, after those 6 minutes above the blue water, it would only ever burn in one direction, toward the end.